One of the most essential questions in economics is, why do economies grow and how are the benefits shared? To begin to answer that question, however, we need a reliable way of measuring economic growth. That's a difficult challenge, which is only getting harder. The system we now use for measuring economic output in the developed world emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War, when most activity still revolved around the production and exchange of physical goods. Since then, what we produce and consume has changed in unimaginable ways, and economic statistics have struggled to keep up. The old methods are ill prepared for a world where companies move goods and people and money between countries, where value is based on digital services rather than physical products, and where giant technology firms give us their products for free in return for our attention and our data. So a rethink of our system of economic measurement is necessary and urgent. For example, it's essential to understanding one of the conundrums facing developed economies, the slowdown in productivity growth. This week on The Big View, we're going to talk about economic statistics. It's what we do at Reuters Breaking Views. We tap our best sources around the world to bring you fresh insights into the biggest stories in global business and finance. I'm your host, Peter Thalassen. My guest this week is Diane Coyle. Diane is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge. She's been thinking deeply about topics like gross domestic product for a long time, and she's also distilled her thinking into a new book, The Measure of Progress, Counting What Really Matters. And full disclosure, Diane and I worked together many years ago at the Independent newspaper before she went into academia. Diane Coyle, welcome to The Big View.
Thank you for inviting me on.
So Diane, you've been studying and writing about GDP for quite some time. I mean, I think you published a book about it more than a decade ago. And even at the time, it was clear there was always this vigorous debate about the measurement of economic output. What to leave it, what to put in, what to leave out, what adjustments and contortions are required to arrive at the numbers that we see every quarter. But you're now making the case that the problems have got worse. I think you write in the book, the structure of the leading economies has changed so much in the past 9 decades that the framework is a distorting lens or even a set of blinkers. So what has changed?
Economic statistics are really important at times of fundamental shifts in the structure of the economy. And that's what we're going through and have been going through for, a decade or more. So what we're missing is the digital revolution. It's almost invisible in official economic statistics.
Mm-hmm.
And so governments and other decision makers don't have available to them really important information. How much is the cloud being used? What prices are people being charged for it? And is it helping their productivity? What about international production chains and the flow of data and blueprints and intellectual property, but also actually where are the bottlenecks? And if we're going into a world where security becomes more important, not understanding the supply chains that drive our economy is a fundamental gap. We have a set of data that measures sectors that were defined in the 1940s and 1950s, occupations defined similarly a long time ago. They've been updated a bit, but they don't capture anything about the supply chains that span different sectors, that span different geographies. So there's a huge set of gaps in the knowledge that governments need to manage the economy well, and also the knowledge that businesses need to understand the commercial environment and the growth environment in which they're operating.
I mean, there have always been limitations in the measurement of economic output, right? I mean, and we think about some of the adjustments that get made to the statistics now. I mean, you wrote about, one big factor in GDP is an estimate of the rent that people would pay to live in houses that they own, for example. Or, some countries have tried to get estimates of black market activity. So there have always been these sort of gaps and attempted adjustments. But you're proposing, you're sort of saying this requires a more fundamental change now.
I think it does, and it's partly about collecting more statistics about digital aspects of the economy. For instance, all the talk about AI improving productivity now, we don't know how many companies are using what AI and what they're doing with it. So very hard to devise policies on that front. But I do think it's getting worse. I mean, as you say, there have always been these adjustments, and once you start making some adjustments to what might be a very pure measure of pounds or dollars running around the economy, then that opens the question, well, why are we not making other adjustments? For example, why are we not attributing a value to all the free digital services that we're using? If we do that, should we be taking into account the fact that part of the incomes and profits of big tech companies are monopoly rents? Do we want a measure that reflects some sense of what the competitive market value would be? And the areas of adjustments that one might want to make have been growing. One area that's been debated ever since the dawn of the GDP statistics in the 1940s is, should we take account of unpaid work in the home? Because it's clearly often economically valuable, and it substitutes for some market activities. So you can hire somebody to do the housekeeping, or you can do it yourself unpaid at home. That domain is expanding, though, because people are producing open source software, they're producing entertaining videos, they're doing what's called user innovation, for example, for medical devices that have very small markets. So all of this free stuff of economic value being done unpaid, there's more of it. And then it works the other way too. If you think about automatic checkouts in the shops, they're saving us time, but they're substituting our unpaid labour. But what was the paid labour of shop employees? That might increase measured productivity for the retailers. But should we not have some idea about the time transaction that's going on there? So I think the areas of adjustment have just grown so much that we have now got to the point where having a big think about what we're doing, part of which will just be more data collection, is needed.
I mean, there is always a problem with measuring those kinds of improvements, right? I mean, you sort of, the classic example is always, someone says, well, 30 years ago, I would have had a television, which was kind of a big box, and it sat on my, on a table, and the screen was this big, and now I can buy a flat screen TV that's, kind of twice the size and much better, and probably costs half as much as it did 30 years ago. I mean, yeah, in pure GDP terms, that new television probably contributes less to GDP than the old one did. That's always been an issue, hasn't it?
Well, new goods have always been an issue, as you say, or quality improvements. The statisticians do try to capture some of the quality improvements by adjusting the price. But then you start getting a measure that's not really price that people have to pay to buy the television. It's the price, a notional price that they're paying for the quality of the output they get from the television. And the more you get away from it's a straightforward macroeconomic measure of the total economic activity, the more you open up the questions, well, what are we trying to do with this? Why are we doing this? Are we actually after a measure of economic welfare? So I think we'll always need something like GDP for macroeconomic purposes. I would simplify that as much as possible for monetary and fiscal policy, and then think much harder and more profoundly about, if we want to understand progress, economic welfare, how our people are doing, then we need to think about different approaches.
Yeah, there is also a question of legitimacy, isn't there? A sense of sort of people thinking these statistics bear some relation to kind of what my life is like. I'm reminded of the famous anecdote from the British political scientist Anand Menon around the time of the Brexit vote, where he was at an event and he warned about leaving the EU would lead to a big drop in UK GDP, and a woman in the crowd shouted back, "That's your bloody GDP, not ours," right?
Yeah.
And so there is this sense which the statistics are disconnected from or not relevant to people's experience. Is that something that you also has that always been there, or has that got worse too?
The distributional aspect has got worse, and I mean the big increase in inequality started in the 1980s, but it's certainly been the case since around the financial crisis that median incomes haven't gone up very much in many countries, and yet but GDP growth has still been happening. So who's getting that GDP growth? I've just set one of our research assistants here the task of trying to think about what would US GDP growth be if you took account of the monopoly rents of the tech sector. So if they're getting all of that GDP growth, it's no wonder that voters in the Midwest are pretty unhappy, looking at the price of eggs going up. And you can't eat TikTok, so watching free videos doesn't help you pay the food and energy bills.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I want to talk about productivity a bit. I mean, this is the central conundrum in some ways of almost most of the developed economies in the world. And there's this idea, that productivity growth, by which we mean improvements in economic output that do not depend on extra labor or capital, is key to improving living standards, and growth rates have declined dramatically. Can you talk a bit about why do you think that is, and how does that question then feed into this debate about measuring economic output?
There are many reasons why productivity growth might have slowed down. Post-financial crisis, there might have been many companies that were saved from going under, and normally the cleaning effect of a recession is that low productivity companies go bust. So that perhaps didn't happen. We've got aging populations, that might be part of the story. We've got crumbling infrastructure in many OECD economies, that might be part of the story. So there are lots of contributing factors. But there are certainly issues about how are we measuring productivity as well. And in some areas of activity where we think we're very productive and the level of productivity is high, the growth in productivity has slowed down the most sharply, which suggests that in some of those areas, which include ICT, professional services, advanced manufacturing, which are digitally intensive, data intensive, suggests that we might not be measuring output particularly well. And I think that's likely to be linked to the price indices that are used to deflate nominal revenues to get a measure of what's called real output. There's a quote from Thomas Schelling, the Nobel laureate economist that I love. He says, what we call real output is actually hypothetical, and it's only the nominal values that are the real ones that we can actually measure in a straightforward way. And now some 4/5 of the advanced economies is what you could class as hard to measure, because it's really difficult to construct a price index that tells you what is the real progress being made here.
Yeah, and that gets us. It's sort of one of the surprising things that when you start looking at productivity, that it basically, even though people talk about it a lot, it's essentially this sort of unexplained thing that is left over once you've accounted for all these other things, which feels very unsatisfactory in some ways.
Yes, and of course in business people think about value added, which is part of the productivity calculation. But what economists want to do is deflate that to take away the impact of just straightforward inflation over time to get at what we would call a real output measure, and that's a tricky beast.
So you would say then that in order to kind of get to the heart of this conundrum, we kind of need to rethink what it is that we're measuring.
Yes, and one thing we can do is what we've always done and try to just do the figures better. And I have done some of that kind of work, working out a more accurate index of the price of telecommunications services, for example. And we added 0.6 percentage points to GDP, I think. So that's worth having. But one of the things I argue in my new book is for looking at time as a metric, both of productivity and of people's well-being. If you think about productivity, then there are some things that we want to do as quickly as possible. And so time saving becomes the metric. So steamships rather than sailing ships, that was time saving. You might now think of things like straightforward health procedures, which can be done robotically. The more efficiently you can do those with the least input of both patients' time and medical staff time, the better. That's more productive. Equally, there are other activities where the more time is spent by highly qualified people, the higher quality and experience you will create. So that in the health example, it would be skilled medical staff with a patient in the ICU, and you want a high quality experience there. But you could think about haircuts. You go to Big Jim's Trims down the road, 10 quid and in and out, or you go to a Mayfair salon and the massage and the hour that you spend chatting to your hairdresser is part of the experience, and the price will reflect the difference there. So that there are two paths for thinking about productivity in a highly service-based economy. And then if you think about how people are spending their time, we've all got a fixed budget. It's 24 hours a day, and you've got to spend it. You can't save it for tomorrow. That's a really good way of thinking about the quality of life. So, of course, you want money, but you want to enjoy what you're doing. And you would resent things like the time tax that businesses impose on you with these terrible voice menus that you can't get through to get the service that you want.
Mm-hmm.
So, or those automatic checkouts in the shops that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, or you can also think about these sort of hidden, a bit like that, what you're talking about there, these sort of hidden things that come into, that sort of intrude on life where, exactly, previously you would do something quite simply, or you'd ask someone to do it for you, and now you can do it yourself, as people say, with a computer or something, but it takes 3 times as long, and kind of can be very frustrating. It's very interesting. I just want to just get into a little bit into the sort of the political economy of this. I mean, there's a famous comment which is attributed, I think, to the management guru Peter Drucker, who said, "What gets measured gets managed." And I suppose the flip side of that is that if it's not being measured, someone maybe has decided that they don't want to manage it. I remember talking to economists years ago who'd spent a long time studying China, and we were talking about the Chinese employment statistics, which are notoriously bad. And this economist said, well, if the Chinese government was serious about improving employment or reducing unemployment, they would make sure they had better data. So it's always stuck with me that to what extent do you think this is a problem, which is that we don't measure these things because we don't want to have to manage them?
It's certainly the case. That's really interesting. It's certainly the case that there are things we could measure about the quality of people's lives that are not being measured, and would create a whole world of pain for politicians if it was part of what they had to think about. And governments currently quite obsessed about increasing growth, partly because, as we were saying earlier, people's living standards haven't gone up very much for a long time. So the focus is on the single GDP measure. But the quality of people's lives depends on a lot more. It depends on what kind of place do you live? Does the street lighting work? Are there potholes? Can you breathe clean air? Can you get your kids to the park easily? And so thinking in the round about, I would think of it as the life's infrastructure. What assets do you need to have access to lead a good life? And that creates real dilemmas for politicians who are worried about the financial market reaction to their spending. They don't want to raise taxes, so there's a limit to what they can do. They can just hope for manna from heaven GDP growth and things will get better down the road. If you immediately start thinking about the whole array of things that people need to get access to lead an economically valuable and good life, that's a more complicated and challenging problem.
So if we think then about solutions, I mean, again, as you mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of discussion about this over almost from the moment these statistics first arrived, and there's been a lot of suggestions saying, we should look at non-financial measures. For a while there was a big movement to say we should measure gross national happiness, for example, which is something I never really fully understood. And then other people say, well, you need to measure natural resources or environmental damage. Why do you think these ideas haven't really got very far in terms of being sort of baked into the official statistics. And is there a better approach?
Yes, so I'm not a fan of measuring happiness or life satisfaction because they are outcomes. Lots of things affect them. If you want to make people happy, they need to get married. What's the government doing in that territory?
Right.
So they're not policy useful measures. Of course, you want people to be happy, but you can't do policy with that. The other things that might be useful. So, for example, knowing about the quality of soil in your crop growing areas is really important because it tells you, is agricultural productivity going to collapse? So that's useful information. But I think the challenge is that there's no agreement among economists and statisticians about what that new set of indicators or measures ought to be. The power of GDP is that it's not only 80 years old, it's widely accepted, there's a consensus around it. So it's a bit like wanting to change from having 3-pin plugs to 2-pin plugs. You've got to get everybody to do the change at once, and therefore you need enough agreement about what to change to. And I think we've not got that. And it's one of the reasons that I keep writing about economic statistics, although it makes you a deeply boring person to talk to at parties. It's actually really important because it's about creating the case for a consensus around an alternative approach to thinking about how our society is going.
So we should come back to that. But one of you talked earlier about this question of time, which I think is really interesting. The other sort of idea that you lay out is basically a strong argument to say we should look at wealth, which I interpret to mean sort of saying we should look at assets and liabilities, not just the annual flow of economic output. What if we did that? What would that imply? How would we go about that?
The argument about wealth is about a really broadly defined balance sheet of the economy, and it's about sustainability broadly understood. Because just as if a company is running down its assets, it's not going to last for a very long time. It's the same story with economic growth. So growth in GDP terms tomorrow and in future depends on maintaining an asset base that can deliver the capital services that are the inputs into the economy. So I would define that broadly, not just physical assets or financial assets, but human capital, natural capital, and also the quality of institutions and the rule of law and the effectiveness of decision-making or organizational structures. And that's complicated, but I think it's important because it tells you, are we consuming at the expense of the future?
Yeah, and I guess also brings debt into the question and into debate and stuff like that, which is often missing.
The environmental economists would exactly argue that we've built up a lot of natural debt in some areas.
I mean, there is a sort of subset of this which has been talked about quite a bit recently in the UK and other places, which is this idea just at the government level that government should be, kind of paying more attention to the balance sheet. What are the assets that the government owns? What are its liabilities? If it's investing, is the investment increasing the value of those assets? And it seems even that seems very hard to do in terms of trying to adjust the way that governments think about this, or in terms of what they measure, or in terms of what they report. I mean, why is it so hard?
Well, I think it's back to this question about what does everybody agree is the right thing to do. If you speak to individual politicians, they completely recognise some of these points. But they'll get slaughtered in the media if they say, okay, growth has been a bit disappointing, but on the other hand, air quality in all our major cities has improved. So it's a sort of dysfunctional trap between the statisticians who produce what they think the politicians want, and the politicians who want what they think the media wants, and the media who think this is what you need to do because that's what the statistics say. So getting from that sort of consensus about what we should be focusing on to a different sort of consensus is really challenging. It happens historically at times of great turmoil. And my goodness, we're in a time of great turmoil now, as well as all the digital change and the things that AI and robotics are bringing down the road to us. There's all the political turmoil and security turmoil that's going on at the moment. So I guess there's more chance now that we'll ultimately end up in maybe 10 years or so with a different framework for thinking about how is our society progressing.
And do you see, are there any places where that have moved in this direction? Are there any examples we can look at that might give you some encouragement on this?
The UK is at the forefront here. We are probably world beating in economic statistics in this sense. There's been a lot of research supported by the Office for National Statistics, and I think a lot of politicians here are actually quite open to it. And if you remember, it was David Cameron who introduced the data on life satisfaction that the Office for National Statistics now produces. So there is definitely progress, and small countries, New Zealand or Wales or Iceland, have introduced formally different frameworks for thinking about well-being. So there is a little bit of progress, but you need to combine that focus on well-being with understanding better the production side of the economy with this extraordinary digital technological transformation that's taking place. They need to be brought together.
Yeah, and that's I'm interested in that, and that maybe that's a good place to sort of try and end up, is because you talked about the sort of the digital transformation that has already happened. People using services which are very often for free in return for their attention, or some sort of collection of data or advertising, and obviously that's a big shift. But we're now looks like we're moving into an even bigger shift where we have sort of a sort of self-teaching computers, algorithms, kind of models that are learning and developing on their own and doing things. It seems like conceptually you potentially end up in a situation where you would have economic activity being performed by robots or by algorithms without any human involvement. I mean, how that sort of scrambles the whole economic output idea, doesn't it?
You can imagine a situation where you've got bots talking to bots doing financial transactions, and actually in financial markets that may be the case already.
Right.
And what's that all about? No, completely. And I was just back in Silicon Valley recently and seeing some of the advances in robotics where there's a convergence between generative AI models, communications improvements, and improvements in the biomechanics of the robots themselves, that makes it not infeasible that we'll get the famous domestic robots who can do your washing and fold your laundry for you, and you can communicate with them in natural language. And then that's amazing, but who's going to buy them? Will all the rents, will it all be kept as monopoly rents and only people who live in Silicon Valley can afford the robots? Or will it become a Ford-style mass consumer good and lead to greater mass prosperity, as we saw in the 1960s and 50s with the kind of automation that took place then?
Mm-hmm.
This is all up for grabs. Understanding how humans and machines take decisions together is completely unexplored territory, or just starting to be explored. Machines tend to assume that humans are rational, and that's obviously not the case. So co-designing for them will be a real challenge. So, it's going to keep me busy and happy for the rest of my career. But it is a unknown territory that we're venturing into.
Yeah, well, that's definitely more food for thought and more ideas and questions for you to ponder. As you say, it doesn't sound like you're going to be short of things to write about and think about for a while. Diane, this was really fascinating. I want to thank you so much for coming on to talk to us about this, and hope we can come back to this at some point in the future.
Thank you. I love talking about it, so anytime.
That's it for this week. This podcast was produced by Oliver Tasich in London. You can listen to a new episode of The Big View every Tuesday on the Reuters app or your favourite platform. Don't forget to tune in to our sister podcast, The Viewsroom, every Thursday, as well as the other great podcasts from the Reuters team, Reuters World News, your daily dose of the biggest global stories, and Reuters Econ World, a weekly deep dive into an economic concept behind the headlines. If you liked what you heard, please follow The Big View and let us know what you thought. And check out our views on the biggest stories in business and finance every day at breakingviews.com and Reuters.com.